Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Erica. Erica is a partner at Redpoint, and I think she would love to do her introduction better than I would, but she's very, very, very impressive.
No, hi, nice to meet you, everybody. As Omri said, my name is Erica Brescia. I'm an MD at Redpoint. I actually just moved into venture in January after over 15 years as a founder and operator. Most recently, I was the chief operating officer at GitHub, which many of you might be familiar with. And as I have spent over 15 years in open source and have been grateful to serve on the board of the Linux Foundation for the past 6.5 years, which is an important organization that I think helps steward a lot of important open source that we all depend on.
Cool. So first question I have for you is, how have you seen open source evolve through the years? We know it's very popular now with startups, but...
Yeah, I mean, open source rules the world, right? I think I'll talk about open source in the context of businesses, which I think is really interesting. I think, open source is just a kind of phenomenon or a way of building software has just been gradually building steam, and now, over 90% of software projects developed today are built on open source. What I think is interesting is, in the very early days of open source, a lot of the time there would be a project, and then sometimes if the project started getting successful, like people would raise funding. This is back in the days of MySQL or Sugar Serum or Jasper, things like that. And there wasn't always a clear business model in mind that people had. It was kind of like the early days of the .com, where it's like, okay, just like we've built something, we'll give you some money, you'll figure it out later. I think what I'm seeing now is companies are much more deliberate about their strategy around open source. Like, why are you going to build an open source? What parts of what you're building are going to be open source? What might be proprietary? How are you going to monetize? And I think the best companies are doing a really good job of setting expectations and kind of having this kind of understood commitment with their community from the very beginning around what will be monetized and what won't, and how people can get involved, and where contributions will be accepted and where they can't. So there's just a much better understanding, I think, of open source as it fits into business models. And then I think the one other really important thing to note is the cloud has changed everything for open source, right? Like initially, there were a bunch of models, open core, things like that. And there were some really fantastic companies that were built. I talked about MySQL, but like Jaspersoft and Penahone, there were a bunch of companies that had like pretty good exits. I think then the cloud vendors came along. Amazon, in particular, was the worst actor, but they all, I think, acted poorly in some cases. But they started taking open source projects, building services around them, not contributing back, and that's caused a shift in how people think about open source licensing and strategy, and building a business that's actually defensible as a result.
Cool. So what types of software do you think should be open source? Like, where is the boundary between open source and proprietary software?
It's interesting, and I think it's shifting too. So I'll talk about some things that I think are obviously need to be open source, and then there are other questions where it's still not entirely clear if you have to be open source or not. So one of the investments that we've done this year is in a company called Dagger. It's from the founders of Docker. And at a high level, what Dagger does is the aim is to provide or bring real software development to building your CI/CD pipelines, right? The whole premise is, hey, we're going to give people these building blocks. They can build in any language. They can share. They can extend. They can build these portable pipelines for any cloud. And you can get the same environment on your laptop as you can in your kind of production CI/CD environment. But something like that, it's literally built to be developed by the community. There's absolutely no way you could build a company like that that's not open source. I think as you move higher up the stack, if you're looking at the infrastructure kind of layer up through the application layer, we don't see a lot of applications being built today in open source. I think there aren't as many advantages. You might have some open source SDKs and things like that, but beyond that, you're never going to get people to really collaborate in an open source fashion on an application that serves a specific purpose. And actually, Sugar CRM, I'm totally dating myself because that's a really old company now, but they kind of tried to go that route and then had to close source it because nobody was participating. And I think the interesting question is which pieces of infrastructure need to be open source, right? I mean, Snowflake, one of our investments, has been a remarkably successful business, and they're not open source. And, I'm on the board of another company, and one of the discussions that we've had as a database company is like, if this is all about just building basically a web service that people are going to be building to, what parts need to be open source? Are people going to care that it's open source? As long as the SDKs are open source, does it matter? And I think the jury is a little bit still out on that, and we're seeing a lot more companies being built in the infrastructure layer that either like are proprietary or are choosing licenses like the BSL, which, while the software is available, is not an open source license. It's not OSI approved, and I do draw a pretty hard line there. Like, it's not open source if it's not OSI approved, it's just source available.
Yeah. And you mentioned when we spoke before that you see open source really as only as projects that actually have community contributions, not as anything that just has source code available on GitHub or something like that.
Yeah, I suppose I'm a bit of a purist in that regard. I mean, the whole, like the open source ethos is around sharing and collaboration and community building. And this is something, going back to that company I talked about before, one of the things we talked about is like, if you're not going to go all in, if you're not going to make the commitment and make the serious investment in building out the team to support and encourage an open source community and build in the open that way, thank you, then you shouldn't go down that path at all, right? Like, either you're open source and you're going to make that a significant investment for your company, and it's going to define a lot of the way you operate and engage with open source developers as well as your customers, or you shouldn't go open source at all, in my view. I don't know. But what's your view on that?
No, I think that's right. I'm wondering, let's say you decide to go open source. How do you get developers to actually contribute code to your platform? Like, how do you incentivize developers to be contributors to your open source project?
Yeah,
it seems like a high bar of engagement.
It's an exceptionally high bar, and I do think it's important to note that, like, having an open source community doesn't just mean having core contributors to a project, right? Like, that's the very like long tail small group of developers that will actually do that. There are a lot of ways to get involved in an open source project, which to me still make it open source without being like kind of a core developer or contributor to the project, right? You can help out with documentation, you can participate in the forums, you can vote or help inform the roadmap, you can join community calls and provide feedback, you can build things with it and share what you're building and teach others how to do it. Like, all of those to me are part of building an open source community. And so when you're going about building a project, I think the key is to just provide like clarity around how people can engage. I was talking to a founder of an open source project that just went like vertically up in terms of adoption, right? It went from like 0 to like 12,000 stars in no time. It was unbelievable. And this guy was like totally overwhelmed with what was going on. And he's like, I'm getting all these PRs, I don't know what to do. Like, where do I go from here? Like, people are getting pissed off because I'm not replying to them. And I said, okay, well, the first thing is like, be clear about what you want. Like, what are your 2 top things that you're going to be focusing on? Where will you look at PRs? Like, where will you be interacting with the community first and set those clear expectations? So I think like there's a good lesson in there in that, you need to be clear with the community. Like, here's how you can engage. Here's what we're looking for. I think you need to spend time building areas or opportunities for discussion, whether it's in a Discord or Slack channel, or whether you're using discourse like forum software, or I think GitHub discussions, because it's so close to the code, and obviously I'm super biased, but I think is a great way to engage your community. So I think you need to start with that. Start with having community calls. Start with interacting. Start with replying to issues. And over time, you'll see this very small number of people that start to contribute. And what you need to do is hold them up, right? Be grateful, be responsive, be deeply engaged with them, and find ways to reward them, not financially, but with recognition for their contributions to your software, because it's really hard to find those folks, and you should treat them like gold. And I think sometimes people overlook that.
A lot of startups today try to sell to developers or kind of rely on developer adoption in order for them to grow. It's a growing trend, and I'm wondering if you're seeing any tips or any like mistakes that companies do when trying to attract developers to use their product, developer focused?
Yeah, I think trying to sell to people too early or sell to the wrong audience can be a huge mistake that people make. I think, when you're I don't even like to think of it as selling to developers because it's not really selling to developers in my view. It's more about like educating and engaging developers and hopefully getting them excited and delivering value to them. I mean, the number one thing when we're working with companies, that developer first companies, which is almost everyone that I invest in is in that space, we tell them to spend, invest in DevRel and content and community folks just like right out of the gate. It's one of the most important things you do is just help people understand how they can get value out of your software. Like, number one, just do that really well. If developers aren't getting excited about what you built, trying to sell to them is going to get you nowhere. And then I think it's like, I'm very, very, very big on PLG. It's how do you build the right motions in your software itself. Like if you never have to have a salesperson reach out, that's amazing. It doesn't work that way for the long term for sure. Like I think every company ends up having an enterprise sales team over time. You need to get that like the wheels and the machine working on that bottoms up. And so, implementing like product analytics platforms, implementing like some of the PLG CRMs that help you kind of understand user behavior on your platform and what behavior indicates that somebody might be likely to buy your paid product, and then giving them a path to upgrade within the product itself. Or if it's an open source project, giving them very clear paths to, okay, here's what you get if you want to buy, and here's how to do it, and not kind of sicking a salesperson on them right away is the key, because as soon as you start doing that, I think you lose developer trust and then you're kind of dead in the water. Nothing else you do matters.
You were speaking earlier about community and the role of community. I'm wondering, where do you see that fit in within an org structure? Is that part of marketing? Is it product? Is it its own function?
The age-old debate. I'm going to be very curious. You're going to have to answer this one after me because there are a lot of differing views on this. I have a pretty strong view that it should be under product and not under marketing. Oh, you agree with me?
I'm with you.
I will say one thing I would love to see more of, which I know is like a tall order, but I would love to see more people who are amazing developers move into marketing, because hiring marketing for developer-first companies is like, it's just near impossible to find fantastic people. I was just talking with a marketing person about this last night, actually. And I think that I think there's a huge opportunity to deliver so much value there. If you really understand developers, you understand how to use language that's not going to be seen as a red flag or throw them off. I think that's hugely valuable. I think if you had a marketing person like that, there is a chance that you could have DevRel and community underneath them. But otherwise, I think it needs to be so integrated into the product experience and so authentic to developers that if you have somebody that's incentivized by like traditional marketing metrics, you're going to be focused on the wrong things from a DevRel and community perspective.
Totally agree.
You agree.
Yeah, we're on the same page. Cool. I wanted to get your opinion on solo founders. I feel like it's a current trend. There's more solo founders out there.
Yeah, I think, and I've backed several solo founders and some teams as well. And I think, it's funny. I went through Y Combinator back in 2013, back in like the good old days when we had 42 companies in my batch. And one of the things they would kind of discourage was solo founders. And I certainly don't. I think you can build something amazing as a solo founder. I do think you have to be aware of what you're not getting when you don't have a co-founder, though. And that's that, usually when you see, 2 or more founders on a team, somebody takes on some of the administrative overhead, right? And like in my experience, I partnered with a deeply technical guy who was an original member of the Apache Software Foundation. He was brilliant from a product perspective. He never really built or led teams or done sales or BD or legal or any of the things. And so I kind of came in and I took on everything other than product and engineering, and we had this really great division that worked out well. If you're a solo founder and there's no one there's no one else to do that, right? And so a lot of the time, especially Paul Graham would be like, oh, just go with just engineers for as long as you can. And I'm like, you get to a point, whether it's 10 or 20 people, we could debate, but like, you need to get help. You really should not be spending time on administrative stuff. And as soon as you take a bunch of money, if you take 15 or 20 million bucks in funding, there's just a lot of admin overhead and things that you have to do, whether it's payroll or stock grants or dealing with your lawyers about, when you need a license for your software or, these myriad other things that come up. And I think it's just not high value use of, a founder's time. And so I tend to encourage solo founders to get somebody operational to help them, I think earlier than conventional wisdom would say, because I just don't think it's the best use of your time. And I think if you can find someone amazing that can just kind of make all that stuff that is not strategically valuable, but it's super important, go away, it's really worth the investment. So, just think about the fact that you don't have a full team to spread the work around. But I'd rather see a solo founder than a shotgun wedding of founders, right? Choosing a founder is definitely like getting married, maybe even more. It's really hard to walk away. And sometimes people are like, oh, I'm going to go search for a co-founder. And I'm like, it's worked for people, but it's a tough thing if it doesn't happen organically. And I've seen founder splits, and they're really painful. So, yeah.
Definitely seen a lot of those shotgun weddings.
And how have you seen them work out very well?
Some of them.
Some of them, yeah, some.
But some people that have known each other for a long time also split, so.
True.
I'm wondering, what does it take to raise an A these days from a top tier fund? I consider Redpoint to be top tier. So.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think, it depends on what sector you're in. So I should lead with that. I think A's look very different in different types of businesses. Some of our partners invest in consumer. I know nothing about consumer. But in general, I think what we're really looking for is some good initial traction. Now, at Redpoint, we have quite deep open source roots. A lot of us have been in open source for a long time. We've all founded companies and kind of know what it takes to build, whether it's a true open source company or just a PLG kind of developer first company. We're very patient and we're willing to come in early. And so we've invested in a lot of pre-revenue Series A companies. It doesn't mean you don't have to have revenue out of the gate. What we are looking for, if it's open source, is some really good traction and growth and adoption within meaningful companies, right? Just having your YC or other accelerator batchmates use your product is not going to clear the bar. But if you've got some good logos and people using it in production, that gets our attention. And what we usually see is somewhere between 5 and 10 design partners who maybe are paying you. I saw the question about the paid POCs earlier. We're not religious about whether or not you need to be paid. I care much more about somebody using something in production in a way that they're taking on risk if it doesn't work out, than seeing whether or not they're paying you a certain amount of money. So I think we're looking for that. We also are looking for, you have to know how you're gonna make money at that point, right? Or you might be wrong, but you better have a very clear idea of okay, these are the steps we're gonna do to start monetizing, because we wanna make sure that you can be in a position with the amount of money we're putting in to get to a Series B in your next round of funding. And that's one of the things that we spend a lot of time right out of the gate with founders on is, okay, let's what's the work back plan? Where do we think we need to be and work back from there? So you need to have enough of a line of sight, I think, at the Series A that we can actually build out a plan like that.
Cool. And Erica, you're on the board of the Linux Foundation. You mentioned that, but I'm wondering, what is the role of the Linux Foundation within open source? I know it's not just Linux anymore, but and how does that interact with companies?
Yeah, it's definitely not Linux anymore. It's we can never change the name. I think we can't change the name, but it is definitely not about Linux. There are over 150 sub-foundations within the Linux Foundation. So the CNCF, some of you might have heard of, very popular projects like Kubernetes are part of the CNCF. And it really kind of has a very wide swath across the internet. We also do a lot of work to support just some like very core fundamental internet technologies that don't have big communities, but that we all, really depend on, things like OpenSSL and things like that. So the Linux Foundation's role is really to bring, I think, efficiency and good governance to open source. At the end of the day, when you have that many projects and that much depth in open source, other than just stewarding the Linux kernel, which is very important, I think, helping new projects understand how to build good governance structures is really important. And then the second piece is we've just like developed this kind of machine that can stamp out foundations. So again, back to my comment about the earlier, about the co-founders, and probably because I'm a COO and like efficiency is in my blood, being able to just know what needs to be done and handle all of the legal overhead and the back end stuff for an open source project, like that's not of strategic value to the project, right? But the LF has an entire staff that takes care of all of that puts on events, that coordinates them. KubeCon is massive. I think they've had up to 12 or 15,000 people at some of those. So we do a lot of work to try to just provide that kind of infrastructure for projects so they can focus on what's important, which is actually building and supporting the communities and building the actual software itself.
Cool. Well, I was wondering if people have any questions in the crowd. I wanted to take a couple because I know we only have a couple minutes left. If not, we can continue.
You've been a founder. You've scaled a huge business as well. We've got early stage founders here, and we've got advanced founders here. Any sort of lessons from things that you did not as well that you could sort of convey to them?
Oh, wow. So many. I could probably give like a several hour talk on that. I think I'll pick a couple of things that I think I learned that are important. I think one thing is sometimes I would get in my own head a little bit about whatever my role is, whether or not it was, as a founder of Bitnami, or then when I moved into GitHub, it's like, oh, because I'm in this role, I'm supposed to be this way, right? Like, oh, the COO of GitHub should look like this, right? And a very wise woman who was a great mentor to me kind of told me that, like, look, you just have to be authentic to you. Like, it's easy to lose track of that when things are moving fast and there are a lot of eyes on you, which there were at GitHub just because of the scale of the company. And sometimes it would kind of throw me off and I think impact my decision making. And I think it's really important, whatever the stage of company, that you just remember who you are and what you're about, and also infuse that into the culture. You cannot build a culture that does not emanate from you and who you are at your core. And I tell founders this all the time. If they ask me a question about, oh, how should I think about benefits, or how should I think about transparency, and how should I think about, and I'm like, look, here's some lessons I've learned around all of that, but ultimately you need to think, what do you want it to feel like to work here, and what feels right to you? And you need to kind of build out the culture and build out your leadership style based on that. So I think that's one really important lesson that I think I'll always take with me. One other one that's a little bit more tactical, but I think an interesting adjustment that founders need to make is how communications need to take place across a company as it scales. When you're 15 or 20 people, it's pretty easy. Everybody's on Slack, everybody knows each other. It's a little harder when you're distributed, but people kind of figure that out. You bring people together for all hands or something like that, and it's pretty easy. As you start to grow, and especially after you start to get past 100 or so people, you don't necessarily know everybody as well. I think you have to spend a lot more time and be really thoughtful in how you communicate information out. And as you get into a much bigger company like GitHub, you have to it's like an onion, right? Concentric circles of communication. And it's easy going from an early stage founder, you just put something in Slack and not worry about it, to keep doing that. And it doesn't work as well when you get to 1,000 people. I think leadership needs to know what's going on and why something's happening, so they're ready to field everything coming into them. And I spent like an inordinate amount of my time at GitHub on comms related to we were navigating the pandemic too, but making sure that the messaging that was going out from the leadership team had the right tone, that we were answering the right questions, that the right people were looped in at a certain time. If we were doing a hiring freeze or something like that, that we were like ready and we had the comms docs in place and everything. It is a lot of work, but I also think it's hugely valuable to keeping things very steady and progressing well, because otherwise when you screw that up, like people get frantic and it's a huge distraction. So it's a tactical thing, but it's something that I don't see a lot of people talking about. And I think it's a really important part of leadership as you grow, is to understand who needs to know what and when, and having a plan so you can keep things like moving in the right order. I'll stop there because like I've made like a gazillion mistakes. So.
Well, Erica, thank you very much for coming. And Erica has told me that she'll come more often, so we're looking forward to that.